What kind of law is so absolute that even the Emperor's angels of death fear it more than annihilation? In the Imperium of Man, fear is a weakness reserved for mortals. It belongs to hive workers who pray for another ration cycle, to guardsmen who clutch their lasguns with shaking hands as the sky screams open, to governors who know their worlds can be erased with a single order stamped in red wax. Fear is not meant for space marines. They are created to stand where fear dies. They are taught to look upon extinction, damnation, and eternal war with calm acceptance. They have faced gods that bleed, horrors that rewrite reality, and enemies that make death seem merciful. And yet, there is one thing they do not speak of. One law they do not test. One boundary they will not cross, even when victory demands it. The Imperium tells its citizens that space marines are above the law. That they answer only to the Emperor, that their word carries the weight of divine will. Entire planets kneel when they arrive. Armies surrender at the sight of their banners. Even the Inquisition, feared by all, treats them with calculated caution. To most of humanity, a space marine appears untouchable, an instrument of war so vital that nothing could ever be allowed to restrain it. But this belief is a carefully maintained illusion. Because buried beneath 10,000 years of propaganda, beneath censored archives and sealed vaults, exists a law so final that it does not need to be enforced openly. It is not a law written for humans. This law does not concern taxation, tithes, or planetary compliance. It does not punish cowardice, disobedience, or even treason in the conventional sense. Space Marines have committed atrocities in the Emperor's name and been praised for it. They have exterminated worlds, defied orders, and prosecuted wars that defied all reason. History records these acts as necessary, forgivable, forgotten, but there is one transgression that cannot be forgiven because it cannot be allowed to exist. A crime that, once committed, cannot be atoned for, not through death, not through penance, not through 1,000 years of loyal service. And the most terrifying truth is this: most space marines are never told what it is. They are raised to believe that loyalty is enough. That faith in the Emperor shields them from judgment. That as long as they fight, kill, and die in his name, nothing else matters. But the Imperium does not survive on faith alone. It survives on control, on secrets layered upon secrets, each one protecting humanity from truths it was never meant to understand. And Space Marines, for all their strength, are not exempt from this protection. In fact, they are the reason it exists. There are records, fragmented, incomplete, heavily redacted, that hint at entire chapters simply ceasing to exist. No declarations of heresy, no great wars of censure, no infamous betrayals like those that scarred the galaxy during the Horus Heresy. These chapters do not fall. They vanish. Their names are struck from imperial histories. Their heraldry disappears from vaults. Their gene seed records are sealed or quietly destroyed. Even other Space Marines, warriors who fought beside them, find their memories questioned, their reports amended, their testimonies buried under layers of bureaucratic correction. It is as if these angels of death were never born at all. In the Imperium, death is common. Extermination is routine, but erasure is rare. Space Marines understand this instinctively. They may not know the details, but they feel the boundary all the same. There are questions they do not ask. Discoveries they report only through the most cautious channels. Relics they seal away rather than study. Not because they are afraid of punishment, but because they are afraid of what follows punishment. They know that some failures are not corrected through execution or absolution. Some failures demand silence. This law is not enforced by armies. It does not arrive with fleets or declarations. It leaves no martyrs and no villains. When it is invoked, there is no spectacle, no warning shot fired across the void. The galaxy simply adjusts, as if correcting an error in reality itself. A name disappears from a register. A fortress monastery is reassigned, then quietly dismantled. A gene line ceases to receive reinforcements. The Imperium does not mourn. It does not explain. It moves on, and that is why Space Marines fear it. They are weapons, yes, but weapons that can be recalled. Unmade, not destroyed in glorious battle, but reduced to a footnote that no one is permitted to read. For warriors whose entire existence is built upon legacy, remembrance, and eternal service, this is a fate worse than death. To die is to be honored. To be erased is to have never mattered. The Emperor understood this long before his sons marched across the stars. He understood that his greatest creations could one day become his greatest threat, not through rebellion alone, but through understanding. Through curiosity, through certainty that they knew better. And so, Woven into the foundations of the Imperium itself, he placed a law that does not shout, does not threaten, and does not forgive. A law that exists not to punish disobedience, but to prevent a truth from ever being fully known. Because some truths do not corrupt through chaos. They do not tempt with power or madness. They do something far worse. They make even gods unnecessary. And somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium, that law has already been broken before. Not once, not twice. Enough times for Space Marines to learn the lesson without ever being taught. Enough times for silence to become tradition. Enough times for fear, true fear, to exist within beings who were never meant to feel it. The question is not whether such a law exists. The question is how close the Imperium is, right now, to invoking it again. Why would an empire that worships strength place limits on its strongest weapons? To understand why Space Marines fear a law they barely comprehend, one must first understand the lie at the heart of their legend. The Imperium presents the Adeptus Astartes as beings beyond restraint, warriors forged to act where normal rules collapse, where bureaucracy hesitates, and where morality becomes irrelevant. They are described as the emperor's will made manifest, answerable only to him and to the necessities of war. This image is not accidental. It is cultivated, reinforced, and spread because it serves a purpose. An unstoppable weapon inspires obedience. An unquestioned authority prevents rebellion. And yet, no empire survives by allowing any force, no matter how loyal, to exist without limitation. Space Marines are taught that they stand apart from humanity, not above it. They are indoctrinated to see themselves as servants, not rulers, even as mortals kneel before them. This contradiction is deliberate. They are given autonomy so vast that it feels like freedom, but it is a freedom bounded by invisible walls. Their chapters operate independently, govern their own recruitment worlds, prosecute wars according to their own doctrines, and answer summons selectively. Even the High Lords of Terra cannot easily compel a chapter to act against its will. To most observers, this looks like absolute power. But absolute power is always a performance. In truth, Space Marines exist within a narrow corridor of acceptable action, one defined not by written statute but by historical precedent and unspoken consequence. They are permitted to be brutal. They are permitted to be merciless. They are even permitted to be wrong, so long as their wrongness can be framed as loyalty. Entire populations have been slaughtered under this justification. Worlds have burned because a chapter deemed it necessary. And the Imperium, desperate and overstretched, has learned to accept these outcomes as the cost of survival. But there is a difference between destruction and disruption. Space Marines are instruments of war, not of change. They are meant to preserve the Imperium's structure, not question its foundations. Their violence is tolerated because it is predictable, ritualized, and ultimately controllable. What terrifies the Imperium is not a Space Marine who kills too much, but one who begins to understand too much. One who stops seeing himself as a tool and starts seeing the machine that wields him. This is why the myth of Space Marine invincibility is so carefully maintained. Not for the benefit of humanity, but for the Astartes themselves. If they believe they are untouchable, they will never look for the chains. They will never ask why certain records are sealed, why some orders are phrased with deliberate vagueness, why entire wars are classified not for strategic reasons, but for philosophical ones. The illusion of supremacy keeps their curiosity pointed outward, toward the enemy, and away from the Imperium's core. Even so, cracks have always existed. There are moments in Imperial history where Space Marines acted with complete confidence in their authority, only to find that authority quietly withdrawn. Requests denied without explanation, reinforcements delayed indefinitely, supply lines rerouted, astropathic messages returned unread. These incidents are never dramatic enough to provoke rebellion, never overt enough to justify protest. They are subtle corrections, reminding even the most powerful chapter that their autonomy is conditional. That their independence exists because it is allowed. Veteran Space Marines feel this instinctively. They speak of it in half-phrases and ritualized caution. A sudden pause before naming certain discoveries. A refusal to pursue lines of inquiry that lead too far from the battlefield. A tradition of destroying artifacts that cannot be classified, rather than submitting them for study. These behaviors are not written into the Codex Astartes, yet they are followed with religious precision. Not because they are ordered, but because chapters that ignored such instincts did not last. The Imperium does not punish Space Marines the way it punishes humans. It does not publicly condemn them, because public condemnation would force explanation. And explanation is dangerous. Instead, It relies on isolation, on administrative suffocation, on historical omission. A chapter that drifts too far from its intended role does not fall in a blaze of infamy, it slowly stops mattering. Its victories go unrecorded, its sacrifices are not commemorated. Its name becomes unfamiliar even to allies. For warriors who fight not just for survival but for legacy, this is an existential threat. Space Marines are immortal in a way humans are not. They live on through records, gene lines, honors, and remembrance. Their greatest fear is not death, because death completes their purpose. Their greatest fear is irrelevance. To have fought, bled, and endured for centuries only to be quietly erased from history is to have failed in the one way that cannot be redeemed. This is the leash the Imperium places upon its angels of death. Not chains of iron, but the promise of meaning, and the threat of its removal. Space Marines are allowed to believe they are free, because belief keeps them obedient. They are allowed to think no law binds them, because discovering the truth firsthand is far worse than being told. And somewhere beyond the edge of formal authority, beyond the reach of chapter masters and high lords alike, exists a final boundary. A point past which even loyalty becomes irrelevant. Space Marines do not know where this boundary lies, only that crossing it has consequences so complete that no warning is ever issued twice. That is why they fear the law they cannot name. Because it does not challenge their strength. It challenges their right to exist at all. How do you obey a law that has no name, no text, and no clear moment of creation? There are no scrolls on Terra that proclaim it. No stone tablets sealed beneath the Imperial Palace. No passage in the Codex Astartes that warns of its consequences. If one were to search the archives of the Administratum, the Librarius of the Adeptus Astartes, or even the forbidden vaults of the Inquisition, they would find only fragments, sentences that end too early, references that lead nowhere, classifications that contradict one another. The law exists not as a decree, but as an absence. And that absence is deliberate. Unlike other imperial laws, this one was never meant to be understood by those it governs. It was designed to function without comprehension, to enforce itself through implication rather than command. Space Marines are not instructed to obey it. They are conditioned to fear the consequences of discovering it. This distinction matters, because obedience born from ignorance is far more reliable than obedience born from threat. The earliest references to the law do not describe it directly. They appear instead as anomalies, records that note a sudden reclassification of entire campaigns, treaties sealed without explanation, or honors revoked posthumously with no cause given. In some cases, a Space Marine chapter is mentioned repeatedly across centuries, only for its name to abruptly vanish from later records, as though it had reached the edge of acceptable memory. Scholars who notice these inconsistencies rarely pursue them. Those who do often find their access restricted, their inquiries redirected, their conclusions quietly corrected by authorities who never explain themselves. Even within the Inquisition, the law is treated as something best approached indirectly. Ordos that pride themselves on absolute authority speak of it in careful hypotheticals. Inquisitors who specialize in Astartes oversight do not issue warnings, they issue silences. A request not to pursue a line of investigation. A recommendation to destroy rather than analyze. An unspoken understanding that some knowledge cannot be reported upward, because there is nowhere safe to send it. This is what makes the law unique. It is not enforced by a single institution. Not by the High Lords, not by the Inquisition, not even by the Adeptus Custodes. It exists above jurisdiction, embedded into the Imperium's operating logic like a failsafe that activates only when a specific condition is met. And that condition is never written down. What little can be inferred suggests that the law does not judge actions in isolation. It does not care how many worlds burn, how many civilians die, or how many enemies are slaughtered. The Imperium has survived 10,000 years of atrocity, it is built upon them. Instead, the law appears to evaluate something far more dangerous, intent combined with understanding. Not what a Space Marine does, but why he does it, and what he believes his actions mean. This is why loyalty alone is not protection. A Space Marine can be utterly devoted to the Emperor and still violate the law. He can prosecute war flawlessly, follow every command, and remain free of corruption, yet still cross the boundary without realizing it. Because the law is not concerned with betrayal. It is concerned with awareness. With the moment a warrior stops accepting the Imperium as necessary and begins seeing it as optional. In this way, the law is invisible even to those who enforce it. There are no judges convened to weigh guilt. No councils that debate interpretation. When the condition is met, the response is automatic, systemic, and irreversible. The Imperium does not decide to act, it simply does. Like a body rejecting a foreign organ, it removes the anomaly before it can spread. This is why Space Marines never hear stories of those who violated the law and survived. Survival would imply precedent, and precedent would invite inquiry. Instead, they hear nothing. A gap in the historical record. A chapter whose honors no longer exist. A gene line quietly discontinued. The lesson is not taught through warning, but through disappearance. Among the Adeptus Astartes, this has produced an unspoken culture of restraint. Librarians are trained to suppress certain lines of thought. Chaplains guide doctrine away from philosophical extremes. Chapter masters discourage excessive speculation, framing it as distraction from duty. These practices are justified as discipline, as focus, as adherence to tradition. But beneath that justification lies something older and colder, instinctive self-preservation. They know, without being told, that some questions lead nowhere safe. The law has no name because naming it would define it, and definition would invite challenge. Instead, it exists as a shadow cast by something too vast to confront directly. It is older than most chapters, older than the Imperium's current structure, possibly even older than the Emperor's public vision for humanity. It is a contingency, not a rule, a measure designed for a future where his greatest weapons might become his greatest liability. And so the Imperium allows its angels of death to believe they are free, while ensuring they never test how free they truly are. The law does not need to be spoken. It only needs to be remembered by the system that was built to survive anything, even its own defenders. Because a law that can be understood can be resisted. But a law that cannot be seen can never be escaped. What happens when even the Imperium refuses to admit that its angels of death ever existed? There are no official records that describe the moment it begins. No alarms sound. No declarations are issued from Terra. When the law makes itself felt, it does so quietly, almost politely, as if the Imperium itself is reluctant to acknowledge what it is about to erase. For the Space Marines caught within its reach, the first sign is not punishment, but distance. Astropathic messages take longer to return. Requests for resupply are acknowledged, then delayed, then forgotten. Imperial commanders who once sought their aid now redirect pleas elsewhere. It is subtle enough to be dismissed at first, chalked up to the chaos of a galaxy at war. But Space Marines are creatures of pattern and discipline. They notice when the patterns change. The first documented instance, if such a word can even be used, does not describe a battle or a betrayal. It describes silence. An entire company of Space Marines deployed to a fringe sector, responding to what was initially classified as a routine compliance action. The region was not marked by chaos, corruption, Xenos infestation, or rebellion. It was, by all available data, unremarkable. And yet, after initial contact, nothing further was heard from them. No distress signal, no final transmission, just absence. When relief forces arrived months later, they found no signs of combat. No bodies, no wreckage. The fortress they had established was intact, its defenses still powered, its halls immaculate. Armor racks stood empty, weapons neatly stored, personal effects arranged with ritual precision. It was as if the Space Marines had simply stood up and walked away, together, without struggle, without hesitation. The Imperium's response was not investigation. It was revision. The deployment was quietly reclassified as incomplete. The sector's records were amended to show no Astartes presence at all. The company's heraldry was removed from campaign logs. Within a decade, even the chapter's internal archives described the formation as having been reassigned elsewhere, its fate left deliberately vague. Those who noticed the discrepancy were reminded that record-keeping during the Long War was imperfect. Errors happened, names were lost, but among the Space Marines themselves, the lesson was unmistakable. Other incidents followed across the centuries. Not frequent enough to form a pattern, but consistent enough to create fear. A strike force recalled mid-campaign without explanation. A chapter whose gene seed tithe was no longer requested. A fortress monastery listed as abandoned, then dismantled by administratum order without consultation. In each case, the same absence of accusation persisted. No one was declared heretic. No banners were torn down. The Imperium behaved as though nothing had gone wrong, because acknowledging wrongdoing would require explaining what had been done. This is how the law enforces itself. Not through condemnation, but through omission. For Space Marines, whose entire existence is defined by recognition, by oaths sworn, honors earned, and battles remembered, this is a unique terror. To fight and die is expected. To fight and be forgotten is unthinkable. Chapters exist to preserve lineage, to pass down names and deeds across millennia. When a chapter's history is interrupted, when its past becomes uncertain, its future becomes fragile. Veteran Astartes speak of brothers who were lost to silence. The phrase carries no official meaning, but it is understood all the same. It is not used lightly. It is not explained. It is spoken only among those who have served long enough to see the Imperium's patterns repeat. These warriors do not speculate about what their lost brothers discovered. Speculation itself feels dangerous. What frightens them most is not that the Imperium can destroy them. They have always known that. What frightens them is that the Imperium can choose not to remember them, and that this choice appears to be made without anger, without urgency, and without regret. As though erasure is not a punishment, but a necessary correction. In these moments, the true nature of the law becomes clearer. It is not a response to rebellion, because rebellion can be crushed. It is not a response to corruption, because corruption can be purged. It is a response to something that cannot be allowed to spread, something that cannot be debated or disproven. Something that must be removed so completely that no trace remains. This is why Space Marines fear the law more than death. Death is final, but it is also honest. Erasure is a lie imposed upon reality itself. It rewrites the past to protect the future. And for an Imperium built on myths, symbols, and sacred history, that kind of lie is the most powerful weapon of all. Somewhere in the depths of Imperial bureaucracy, the absence of a chapter is filed away as a clerical adjustment. Somewhere else, a librarian feels a sudden, inexplicable certainty that a line of inquiry should not be pursued. And across the galaxy, Space Marines continue to fight, careful not to look too closely at the shape of the silence surrounding them. Because they have learned, through disappearance rather than decree, that when the Imperium stops speaking your name, it has already decided you should never have existed. Why would the Emperor himself design a law meant to restrain his own angels of death? To understand the existence of this law, one must abandon the comforting fiction that the Emperor trusted his creations completely. The Emperor did not build the Imperium on hope. He built it on foresight, cold, merciless, and unsentimental. Every institution he forged carried within it a counterweight, a means of control designed not for peacetime, but for failure. The Adeptus Mechanicus had its dogma to limit innovation. The Administratum had its endless layers of delay to prevent unilateral action. Even the Primarchs, demi-gods of war, were scattered across the stars rather than kept united. The Emperor understood a truth few of his followers dared to confront: power without restraint does not protect humanity. It replaces it. The Space Marines were never meant to rule. They were never meant to inherit the Imperium. They were meant to fight until fighting was no longer necessary, and then to fade into history. This intention is visible not in Imperial sermons, but in Imperial architecture. In the way chapters are isolated from one another. In the genetic degradation built into their gene seed. In the rituals that bind them to eternal war, ensuring they never fully integrate with the society they defend. The Emperor did not fear that his angels would rebel. He feared something far worse, that they would succeed too well. A victorious Space Marine is a dangerous thing. Not because he might turn traitor, but because he might begin to ask why humanity still needs to be ruled by fragile mortals at all. He might look at a galaxy kept alive only by constant sacrifice and conclude that the Imperium's structure is not sacred, merely habitual. And once such a conclusion is reached, loyalty becomes conditional. Not to chaos, not to ambition, but to reason. This is the thought the law was designed to extinguish. Long before the Horus heresy, the Emperor anticipated that his greatest weapons might one day outgrow their purpose. The Primarchs were embodiments of aspects of his will, but even they were limited in number and scope. The Space Marines, however, could be replicated endlessly. An immortal warrior caste, superior in every measurable way, unified by culture and blood, such a force, left unchecked, would inevitably redefine the Imperium around itself. Humanity would survive, but it would no longer matter. The Emperor would not allow that future. So the law was embedded not as an edict, but as a condition of existence. It was designed to activate only when a Space Marine, or an entire chapter, ceased to function as a weapon and began to function as an alternative. When they no longer fought to preserve the Imperium, but to replace its underlying logic with their own. Not rebellion, not ambition, replacement. This is why the law does not care about victory or defeat. A chapter can fail catastrophically and be forgiven. It can succeed gloriously and be celebrated. But if it begins to understand the Imperium as a system that can be improved, optimized, or transcended by Astartes' governance, it crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. At that point, the chapter is no longer an asset. It is a prototype for a future the Emperor explicitly rejected. Even the Custodes understand this, though they rarely speak of it. Their loyalty is not to the Imperium as it exists, but to the Emperor's original vision, one where humanity, not transhuman warriors, would ultimately rule itself. The law exists to protect that outcome, even if it requires sacrificing the very beings created to ensure humanity's survival. In this sense, the law is not cruel. It is consistent. What makes it terrifying is that it is not enforced by emotion or judgment. There is no anger in its application. No sense of betrayal. A chapter that triggers the law is not hated. It is corrected, removed from the equation like a flawed variable. The Imperium does not mourn it because mourning would imply loss. And in the Emperor's calculus, nothing essential has been lost. This is the chain that binds the angels of death. Not hatred, not fear of punishment, but the knowledge, half-remembered, instinctive, never spoken, that they are tolerated only so long as they remain temporary. That their immortality is a lie, sustained by relevance. That the moment they stop being necessary, or worse, become sufficient, the Imperium will let them go. And so Space Marines fight endlessly, not just to defeat the enemies of mankind, but to prove they are still needed. They cling to war as proof of purpose. They reject peace not because they love violence, but because peace invites reflection. And reflection invites the kind of understanding that activates the law. The Emperor forged his angels with unmatched strength, then bound them with a rule so absolute it does not need to be spoken. A law not meant to protect the Imperium from its enemies, but to protect humanity from its saviors. Because the greatest threat to mankind was never the monsters beyond the stars. It was the possibility that someone stronger might decide mankind was obsolete. And if that law still exists, how many Space Marines are already standing too close to it? The Imperium will never admit that such a law governs its greatest warriors. It cannot. To acknowledge it would mean admitting that the Emperor did not trust his own angels, that the saviors of mankind were never meant to inherit the future they bled to protect. So instead, the truth is buried beneath ritual, doctrine, and endless war. The galaxy is kept loud, screaming with conflict, so no one notices the silence where entire legacies should be. Space Marines continue to fight because fighting is safe. War keeps them aligned with purpose. It keeps their thoughts narrow, their identities clear, their existence justified. A Space Marine at war does not ask why the Imperium is broken. He asks only where the enemy is. And that is exactly how the Imperium needs him to think. Because the moment an angel of death looks beyond the battlefield, beyond orders, beyond doctrine, beyond necessity, he begins to approach the edge of something final. There are chapters that sense this more keenly than others. They codify restraint into tradition. They destroy knowledge they cannot contextualize. They refuse to speculate on the Emperor's ultimate intentions. Not out of ignorance, but out of survival. Their chaplains preach humility not to honor humanity, but to protect their brothers from understanding too much. Their librarians lock away truths not because they are dangerous, but because they are complete. For completion is the real threat. The Imperium can survive corruption. It can survive rebellion. It can even survive damnation, because damnation can be fought. But it cannot survive resolution. It cannot survive a final answer to why things are the way they are. The law exists to ensure that no Space Marine ever becomes that answer. That no chapter ever reaches a conclusion so sound, so efficient, so inevitable that the Imperium itself becomes unnecessary. And so, when the law is invoked, it does not roar. It does not burn. It simply closes a door that was never meant to be opened. The galaxy adjusts, records change, memories soften, 1,000 small bureaucratic decisions align into a single outcome, and an entire legacy slips quietly out of existence. No one celebrates, no one mourns. The Imperium endures. Somewhere, a Space Marine pauses before asking a question he cannot quite articulate. Somewhere, a chapter master decides not to pursue a line of thought that feels too complete. Somewhere, a librarian seals a tome and never opens it again. None of them know the law by name. None of them need to. Because fear does not require understanding. The angels of death were created to be eternal, but eternity was never promised to them. Only usefulness was. And the Emperor, in his infinite foresight, ensured that the moment they ceased to be tools and began to resemble solutions, they would be corrected, gently, absolutely, and forever. So the Imperium marches on, carried on the shoulders of warriors who believed themselves free, while instinctively avoiding the one thing that could end them. Not defeat, not corruption, not rebellion, understanding. And now that you know this law exists, now that you have followed its shadow to the edge of comprehension, ask yourself something carefully. If even space marines fear crossing that line,